Alright. Hola Mary, espero que todo anda bien, espero que todavía estás disfrutando de tu viaje. Um, no hay mucho que reportar de aquí, not much reportable here. I'm just sitting on the floor while I'm recording by the heater to try to stay warm, because, I think it's cold all the time when I record. But not much new here. I am using a new program to try to record these little sessions of ours because my last one kept crashing and I was losing a lot of work, and I figured, well, that's not going to work now, is it? So I hope this one will be a little better for our purposes but I don't know. I guess we'll see. Well, what are we going to do today, you may be wondering? Well, I figured we would go over the Spanish passive voice. And I'm mostly kind of reviewing over this because a lot of the applications are pretty similar in Spanish and English for the passive voice, but a lot of the time in both languages, people misuse the passive voice when we are speaking because the passive voice generally we're not supposed to use when we're speaking. A lot of the times there's errors in writing, it's a whole thing, but I figured we'd go over the nuances of the passive voice in Spanish and kind of familiarize yourself like how it works because obviously as your comprehension it keeps expanding in Spanish and the more you read, the more you write, the more you'll kind of notice these types of patterns, and I figured it's just something good to get in your head. So, without further ado, let's go into it. But before we can talk about the passive voice, we obviously got to review the active voice because the active voice is like the foundational building block of how we construct the passive. And obviously, you know what the active voice is. It's pretty much the same in English. We're using it when we're speaking like to each other all the time. I'm using it right now. We're putting the focus on who or what is carrying out an action or event when we're using the passive voice. So, we don't really care what the event is. Like, our main focus is who is doing what. So we're going to use this little example here and keep this example in mind because we're going to reuse it when we're uh, going over to the passive, and we're going to use this as a base. So, for example, we have el taxista conduce a su pasajero al aeropuerto. So the taxi driver is driving their passenger to the airport. Pretty cut and dry. The taxi driver is the subject of the sentence, and even though the passenger technically is like a living being, it's still considered the object of this sentence, so keep that in mind as well. Um, and again, pretty cut and dry. Active voice is pretty straightforward. We're focusing on who's doing what, not what's actually happening. And that is helpful when we're talking about the passive because essentially the passive voice is we actually do direct our focus onto the action itself instead of like focusing on who's doing what. And other than just focusing on the action, we're also looking at who's impacted by the action. That may sound kind of similar to like who's doing the action, but just remember like the action is more of an impact, not actually doing. So, in English and in Spanish, the passive voice is usually reserved for like writing contexts such as like formal writing or reporting events. So like for instance, when you pick up a newspaper and you're flipping through it and you're reading it, that'll generally be in the passive voice because, like, among writers, it is considered the most objective voice, and the whole point of journalism is to attempt to be objective. At least it should be. But that's generally when you're going to see it. It'll be written. But of course, as I mentioned, there is a way we do use it in everyday speech, and it only sounds natural if you use it in a specific way, which is the pasiva refleja or the passive se. We'll get into that more in a second after we kind of talk about how we construct the passive voice in Spanish, right? Okay. So, how do we form the passive? So, remember that little sentence we were talking about, like the taxi driver? We're going to use this as a framework to how to turn an active sentence into a passive sentence. Again, building block style. So, the first step is to take the object of the active sentence and turn it into the subject of the passive sentence. And remember how I talked about how even though the passenger technically is like a person and not a thing, it was the object. So now the passenger becomes our subject in the passive sentence. So el pasajero is now more important than the taxi driver. And then we have our second step. We take the auxiliary verb of ser, which obviously can be conjugated to es or fue, and we put that in front of the past participle of the active sentence. So it's kind of like reordering. So instead of conduce, we'll say es conducido. So the passenger is being driven. So, make sense? And then we have our little third step. The subject of the active sentence becomes the passive agent. And in English and in Spanish, the passive agent can technically be omitted. So if we wanted to, we could end this sentence like right here. Like we don't have to mention the taxi driver at all. But for educational purposes, I'm going to leave it here because if you do decide to introduce the passive agent in a sentence, you have to introduce it with the preposition por. And see our little formula here, because we love formulas for language. We have the ser, the past participle, like we've done many times, and in those parentheses, we're kind of talking about the stuff that can technically be left out. So por and the passive agent. So again, we are just essentially restructuring the sentence. It's very similar to how we do it in English. It's the different order that makes it passive. And again, we're refocusing like our attention onto a different thing. So instead of having el taxista conduce a su pasajero al aeropuerto, we have el pasajero es conducido al aeropuerto por el taxista. So we're focusing on the action of like what's happening. We're focusing on the driving part, not the taxi driver. We don't really care. And again, like you can technically omit the passive agent, but it also depends on like what you're talking about, what you're writing about, whether it makes sense in the context of what you're writing or talking about. So, but just keep that in mind. Now, for a little bit of practice, I want to see if you can rewrite these active voice sentences into passive voice sentences. Now, I'll be quiet for a little bit. You can obviously like write this down or do it in your head, whatever works better for you. I'll be quiet for just a second. You can pause me as well. And I'll come back with the answers in just a minute. All right. Let's see how we did, shall we? So, I added some extra effects. So, for that first one, René escribió un libro. And I also will preface this by saying there are a couple different ways you can turn these active sentences into passive sentences. So, they don't have to be exactly how I wrote them down. Like, obviously, like I told you, you can omit certain information to make it more concise. But as long as you kind of understand the basic reordering of the sentence, you're good. So, René escribió un libro. So, if we wanted to make that passive, we could make it El libro fue escrito por René. So, again, like we talked about, we're shifting our focus and basically reversing the order. So now the book that was written by René is the main focus instead of René actually writing the book. Or that second one, sus abuelos construyeron una casa nueva. So someone's grandparents is built a new house. And the way we do that is la casa nueva fue construido por sus abuelos. And again, you can obviously omit like nueva or certain details if you so wish, but that's essentially like how we would restructure it. The house will be the main focus, not who built it. And the same thing applies to that third one. Mi mamá está preparando café. So my mother is preparing coffee. Like, and that would turn into el café fue preparado por mi mamá. So the coffee was prepared by my mother. Again, coffee is now the main focus, not who made it. And then that fourth one, yeah, I know how numbers work, but that fourth one would be Los españoles establecieron colonias en Sudamérica en 493. So the Spanish colonized South America and so and so. I believe that's the right year, but I may be mistaken. But then that would turn into like focusing on the colonies, obviously, because that's kind of how the pattern is. Las colonias sudamericanas fueron establecidos por los españoles and yada yada yada. And again, you can omit certain information here. You don't technically have to say who did it. Like, you can omit the Spanish and just say the year, or you can omit the year too, as long as it still works and as long as you reordered the sentence. And again, like, this sentence is a good example of like how history books would be written, because again, most of the passive is in the written form. So just keep that in mind. Good job. I'm sure you did great. All right. So now what were we talking about? Now we're going to be talking about the impersonal and the passive se. So, what is that? Remember how I say there is one way we do use the passive in actually talking? Yeah. But we do need to understand like how the impersonal works before we can worry about the passive. So, what is the impersonal se? Well, the impersonal is obviously not referring to a specific person. That's what makes it impersonal. It's usually general, sweeping statements about people or a place, and you often use this when you're like making general statements or you're asking questions about like a collective. So, again, if you're not referring to a specific person, you're using the impersonal. So, for instance, in our little example, we have en los Estados Unidos se comen mucho. And this doesn't translate perfectly to English because there's a couple ways you could say this, but the general gist of it is in the United States, one eats a lot. You could also say in the United States, they eat a lot. But point is, you're making a general, sweeping statement about a population or a group or a place. Now, on the other side of things, when we are using the passive se, we're also similarly not really referring to a specific person. We're mostly talking about what happened to an object without really talking about who carried out the action. And as a general rule, we only use transitive verbs when we're using the passive se. So, and we are usually referring to inanimate object. There are some times, like in slang and stuff, where we do use the passive to refer to actual people, but that's not very common. So, for instance, se alquilan condominios aquí. So they rent condos here. They're not specifying who we're actually talking about, who's actually renting out the condos. We are just focusing on the condos that are being rented here. Make sense? All right. So I figured let's go into more construction of the passive se. So again, I said the subject cannot be a person, it'll usually be an inanimate object, and se will always be followed by whatever verb you're using in the third person. And that can be singular or plural, it depends on what you're talking about, depends on context. And then we also have how the passive can be used in indicative and subjunctive, so just keep that in mind. And the passive agent is omitted, usually. Again, that kind of flip flops around depending on what you're talking about, like how we talked about when you're constructing the general passive. And again, we only use transitive verbs. So those are verbs, obviously, that need an object to receive the action. So only those types of verbs. And now I'm going to turn it over to you again. There's just these three here. Obviously, like a little hint, these will all use se, like with the verbs underneath here. So I just want to see if you can conjugate these correctly. See how you do. Pause me, go ahead, and yeah, see if you can figure these ones out. All right, let's check these. So this one, that first one, will be like the verb is to spend, gastar. So in this context, we would use se gastó mucho dinero en el mercado. Again, we're not referring to a specific person. We're just talking about someone who may have someone, but the main focus is that a lot of money was spent at the market today. So se gastó. And then that other one, like I figured to make another generalization, the verb is vender, to sell. So en las colinas negras, alhajas de oro. Now, alhajas de oro is like there's a couple different translations, but fun vocabulary fact of the day that can also be used to describe jewelry. So, in this case, it'd be en las colinas negras se vende alhajas de oro. Again, we're not referring to a specific person or a business or a particular jeweler. We're just talking about like the general thing. In the Black Hills, they sell gold jewelry. And then that last one, like to search, buscar, actrices rubias para una película nueva. So they're looking for blonde actresses for a new movie. And in that case, it would be se buscan actrices rubias para una película nueva. Again, we don't know who's looking for these blonde actresses. We don't really care. It could be the director, the casting agent, the producer. All we care about is that they are currently looking for blonde actresses for some new movie. All right? All right. And there's more. Now, I did say that we were going over the passive, but there is something I figured I'd bring up while we're here because there's a little element in Spanish that doesn't exist in English and it can often be confusing, and there's a couple different scholarly debates on how it's actually used. And a lot of the times when English speakers are learning Spanish or an English speaker an English speaker is teaching Spanish, they forget about this because it doesn't exist in the English language. But we'll get into that more. So, what are we talking about? We are talking about the Spanish middle voice, or the voz media. And it's kind of what it sounds like. It's somewhere in between the active and the passive. And it's a reflexive construction that is used to describe like accidental or unplanned actions. Now, this doesn't exist at all in English to my knowledge, and when I was doing research for this, there are a couple contradicting definitions of the middle voice, like because the middle voice doesn't exist in certain Spanish countries or communities, like so just keep that in mind, but this is still something good to go over, like if you ever hear this, because it's difficult to translate directly into English. Like, it's the middle ground between passive and active, and it can be a little weird to think about, but I figured we'd kind of go over it anyway. So, the middle voice is, well, we're also using se, like we have been recently. And in this case, the se is followed by an indirect object pronoun, so that can be me, le, te, etc. And that indicates this, it's supposed to indicate the subject and the verb. And since the subject is only being referred to via the object, it gives the sense that the occurrence is not the subject's fault. Again, sometimes this is called accidental reflexive or the accidental voice, but we call it the middle voice. So, and here's again our little formula here: se, indirect object pronoun, and then the verb. And also to note, don't try to translate some of these completely literally because, faux instance, another typo. I'm a professional. But if we did that with this example phrase, it would be weird. So let's take a look at that. Se me derramó el té. I spilt my tea is the correct way to translate this. But if you translated this literally, it would be the coffee got spilled by me, and it doesn't make sense. So again, this is like the difficult part of teaching Spanish because it's not something that directly translates over to English very well. So if you say me derramó el té, just because it translates literally to the coffee got spilled by me, like we would just say I spilled my tea. Again, accidental type of thing. So I know this is a weird concept, but I want to see if you can kind of translate these phrases into English without going super literal. And go ahead and pause me. I'll be back in a second. All right, let's see how you did. I'm sure you did pretty good, but obviously, this is kind of a difficult concept to understand because, again, it's not something that can really be traced back to English. But let's just take a look. So, se me olvidaron mis libros. So, I forgot my books. You wouldn't translate it to the books were forgotten by me. You would just say, I forgot my books. Or se le rompió el plato. So they broke the plate. You wouldn't say the plate was broken by them, like as it implies. Again, the trick is to remember you can't translate everything literally. So they just broke the plate. Or this one is like more of a question. Se te perdieron tus llaves. Like, and that would be, did you lose your keys? So, again, don't translate this literally because otherwise it would be like, were the keys lost by you? And that doesn't make much sense. So, again, the middle voice is a weird concept in Spanish, but again, remember that it is accidental occurrences kind of in the middle between passive and active. And obviously, you also got to remember those le and me pronouns too, because it is like the rare occurrence in Spanish that these two pronouns are put together in the same sentence, like right after another. So just keep that in mind. I think I say that way too much, but you know. So that's a little bit of a brief introduction to the middle voice. Again, there's a couple different translations in Spanish academics, and depending on where you are, like the usage will be different. But like we'll just focus on the middle ground between active and passive as our working definition. All right, good job, Mary. Buen hecho. I know this is a little bit of a weirder lesson that we're going to do, but if you have any questions, you can obviously ask me. The passive voice, like, I bet you can get down pretty easily. A lot of it just takes a little bit of practice. So, I do recommend, like, practicing using the se. Like, if you're ever talking to, like, somebody, or if you are just wanting to practice referring to inanimate objects, something like that. Work on that. And I do recommend there is a good YouTube channel called Hablamos Español. There is a Spanish teacher who teaches Spanish as a second language, and he has a good video kind of explaining how the middle voice works too, if you want more information on that. Older guy glasses, speaks Spanish, you can't miss him. But yeah, so that's all from me today. I hope you're doing well. Again, if you have any questions, just ask me, and hopefully I can get this video out to you soon because, hey, my program didn't crash at all while I was filming this, so I'm so happy. Well, I'll see you later, Mary. Adios.